Hey, what's up guys, welcome back to Gabriel Prod. This time we are going to see a classic effect. An effect that I believe is familiar to most of us. It's the Dragon Ball charging key power-up effect thing that they do when they are gathering energy, you know? I mean, why not, right? It's a pretty cool effect. And there's a few cool tricks in here. Alright, and as always, this is available on my Patreon page. In case you are interested, you help me out to keep the channel alive, and you get plenty of shaders and effects that you can use in your game. Links in the description. So, with that being said, let's see how we can do this. So, quick overview. We got this mesh on the ground for the shockwaves, and this mesh that looks like a capsule, and both use the same shader and same texture as well. Then we got this texture, which is the hour texture, that also uses the same shader. The rest are a few simple particles and whatnot. So for this bottom part right here, I used Blender to create the mesh, and I started with the circle. In edit mode, I extrude all the vertices and left them in the same place. Then I scaled them down just like this. Now with this disk, I made the UVs by choosing Light Map Pack, and then before selecting every face with A, I selected only one face, so I can press U and choose Follow Active Quads, and I end up with these straight rectangle UVs. Now I made sure that the UVs are centered, but they will not fill the whole area, at least vertically, and you will see why in a moment. Then I proceeded to scale this vertex to 0, and with Ctrl R, I added a new edge loop, enabling me to remove the duplicated vertex in the center with Alt M and choose Merge by Distance. Alright, by doing this in the UVs now I got these spikes which represent the center of our circle, and they need to be facing in the opposite direction. And then I proceeded to add a few more edge loops like this. Now by pressing O, I can turn on proportionally edit, so I push this down. And I also push the vertices in the extremities up. And I made sure to select Shader Smooth to smooth the faces. And I also made sure to push the UVs to the top of the UV area. And you don't necessarily need to stretch this outside of the boundaries, by the way. And instead of exporting this as an FBX this time, I'm gonna save the blend file directly to my project. I mean, why not? With that mesh being done, I proceed to Photoshop to create a proper texture. And well, this isn't easy to explain since I can't guide your hand. But the idea is to start with a brush with low opacity and draw some random spikes like this, like if they were mountains. Then I pass again, but this time with a smaller brush, and then again with even a smaller brush, but with a higher opacity, so I can start creating the bright edge of this texture. And it doesn't need to be perfect. We are going to blur this out, by the way. Then I painted the bottom with a big brush and with low opacity to give some brightness, but make sure to leave some dark at the bottom. Now I just added a few bright areas with a big brush like this, and as you can see, the idea is now to use a motion blur. Since this is going to be a really fast-paced effect, we need to apply a motion blur to the texture, but before that I also add a few more details and made sure to create a few more white edges. Oh, and before the blur, I also offsetted this right here, so I could create a seamless texture. And to fix this hard edge, I used the smudge tool and a low opacity brush, by the way. Alright, so before exporting this as a PNG, I added the motion blur, vertically of course, and that's it. Now here's what we're gonna do. If I go to Unity and apply the texture to the mesh, we are going to scroll across the Y to create this effect, which is pretty cool, right? And this happens because I left the UVs of the mesh in the top part of the UV area. So when it gets near that part, we start seeing the texture mapped on the circle, creating this nice effect. And I left the UVs outside of the boundaries, but if I make sure the UVs fit in here, and then in Unity I start playing with the tiling, I get the same effect. So leaving the UVs outside or playing with the tiling offset is the same thing. I'm actually going to leave the UVs inside of the boundaries. Alright, so it's shader time. And for that I created a new unlit shader. And by the way, I'm on the universal render pipeline. Okay, so we need to scroll the main texture and then add some dissolve. But let's start by changing the blend mode to be additive, the surface to be transparent, and turn on two-sided. The first properties of this shader are going to be a color in HDR mode with white as default and alpha at 100. And the second property is a texture that we are going to name main texture. With this, we can create the basic color and texture setup. Nothing too fancy, just multiply the texture with the color. And since we need to control the color with a particle system, let's also multiply this with a vertex color node. And then we can connect it to the color and alpha input of the unlit master shader. Oh, and alpha clip threshold must be at 0, by the way. Okay, that's the basics. Now for the scroll we needed a vector 2 to control the main texture. Okay, and we are actually not going to use this in the final effect, but I want to show you something. Now we are going to multiply this with a time node, and let's connect this to a tiling and offset node, more specifically to the offset which is responsible for scrolling the texture. This node is very useful because we can also control the tiling of the main texture. We just need to create another vector 2 property. Okay, cool. Now, if we connect this to the UV input of the main texture, we should see it scrolling. Let me just add the texture that I created earlier, and here we go, it's scrolling. Great. Now back to Unity. I created an empty, and inside that empty I attached a particle system for the ground winds or the shock waves. Let's just not forget to rotate this -90 degrees in the X, which at the moment will have a duration of 2, with 1 second for the lifetime and 0 for the start speed. And I also turn on 3D start size so I can later on control the size of the mesh. And I also set the color to gray. Emission is okay for now. We can turn off size, by the way. And down here in render mode, I selected mesh. And if I go to my Blender file, which I saved directly inside my Unity project, I have access to the mesh, which I can drag and drop here. Then I created a material out of the shader, renamed it, and assigned it to my particle system. And nothing special happens in the beginning. Well, that's because the UVs are not intersecting the texture. If I start scrolling the texture in the y-axis, I get this pretty cool effect. And I'm spawning 10 particles, so it's super bright. And I decreased the gray just to be more visible for now. But if I start moving around, the mesh will always be facing the camera, and that's because the render alignment is set to view instead of local. Okay, cool. At this point, now I was able to play with the tiling of the texture in the X, and it creates a different effect, because it repeats the main texture. You can play with that, it's pretty cool. Okay, so at this point I was also missing something important. I wanted to dissolve this near the end. So for that to happen, I went back to shader graph and I added a Voronoi node. You can use other noises, of course. I added a vector 1 to control the scale of the dissolve, by the way. In this case, the scale of the Voronoi. And this noise is going to be connected to a power node. That will help us control the dissolve amount. Let me just push this forward because all is left is multiply the power node with the main texture like this, and it will enable us to dissolve the main texture. Right? Pretty cool. But I wanted to control the dissolve amount through the particle system. So I used the UV node with the channel set to UV1. Don't forget to set the channel to UV1 if you are following this, it's important. And if I split this, I get the RGBA, which in other words is basically a vector 4 that I can control in the particle system with custom vertex streams. So I actually connected the alpha of the power node, but you can connect other values if you want. Back to Unity, all I gotta do is turn on custom vertex streams in the particle system, and I need to add UV2 and custom1.xyzwv. So I can come up here and turn on custom data and set the mode to a vector. Now if I play with the last parameter, which is the one I choose in shader graph, I can control the dissolve amount, which is pretty cool, right? And we can then control the dissolve amount with a curve. Right? And dissolve at the end, just like I wanted. But it doesn't work very well for now, because there's a flaw in this shader. We want to control this main text scroll also in the custom data, because we want to say that it will scroll quickly in the beginning and then slower at the end. Fortunately, all we gotta do is go to the shader, remove the vector 2, which is the main text speed, and the multiply node. And then add a vector 2 connected to the offset. And I'm going to connect the B of the UV to the Y, since I only want to control the scroll vertically. That's why I leave the X at 0. So now we got control over the scroll here in the custom data. Let me just set the dissolve to 0 so I can better show you how this works. And if we use a curve similar to this one, we will get this crazy stuff because we are spawning 10 particles per second. So let me just set the emission to 0 and add a burst of 1 particle. Okay, much better. So we got the text scrolling and then it stops at the end. But we still see the hard edges all around, right? So let's actually turn on color of lifetime and add the key here. And the last one is going to be black, which we can actually move it a little bit back so it clips the hard edges at the end, like this. Ha! And that's getting pretty cool, right? We are getting somewhere now. Now make sure the scroll curve goes from 0 to around minus 0.6. At least that's a good value in my case. Okay. Now if we set the dissolve parameter to a curve, we get a little bit of dissolve at the end. And we can control the dissolve amount right here. 20 is too much, but around 5 seems okay. Alright, so final adjustments to the particle system are shorter lifetime between 0.3 and 0.4. Size it's going to be rendered between 3.5 and 2.5 in X and Y, and between 2 and 1 in Z. The start rotation is going to be rendered between 360 and minus 360, so it's clockwise and counterclockwise. And if we crank up the rate over time to 10, we get this cool effect. Pretty cool. We can also set the size of lifetime to have this curve, the green one, and that's it. It's looking really nice. At this moment, the shockwaves on the ground are really cool. All is left to do is choose a cool color, and then maybe increase the intensity of the HDR color, right? Okay, so it's looking good. Now, we need to add a few more things. So for the capsule, I opened my Blender file directly from Unity, just need to double click it, that's the advantage, and then added a sphere. I smoothed the faces with shader smooth, and the idea here is to enter in edit mode and erase this upper part, more or less around here. And then with the proportional editing on, O for shortcut, I scaled down this top vertex and dragged them up, creating a shape similar to this one. The UVs are already done on the sphere, which is great. I just made sure to fill the whole area this time. Okay, so I saved this blend file and went back to Unity. Now I duplicated the ground wine particle system and rename it to shell or something like that. Then I assigned the capsule mesh just like this in the renderer. Okay. And I forgot to change the pivot, so I went back to Blender and selected this vertex at the bottom, and with Shift S I chose cursor to select it. Then in object mode with Ctrl Shift Alt C I chose origin to 3D cursor. Okay, so now I can set the Y to 0, so it's on the ground. Then I decrease the rate over time to 8. And what's important here is to change the size over lifetime. I switch it to separate axis and set the X and Y to be flat. Now in the Z I use this curve, but I push it a little bit in the beginning up and push it back at the end. Okay, looking pretty cool so far, right? Now, in relation to the ground wine, this is too big. It also depends on character, obviously, but I decreased these values to be smaller, ending up with a more balanced effect, okay? Now, final touches for this particle system was setting the dissolve curve to be like this, so the texture is dissolved in the beginning, and then not so much in the middle, and then totally dissolved again at the end. Okay, then I made the colors a bit less saturated on both particle systems, okay? Now, for the sake of this tutorial, so it doesn't get really long, I went back to Photoshop and duplicated the layer with the original texture I created, and then I pushed this a little bit up with Ctrl T. Now with the lasso tool I selected this part, rotated, and placed it like this, more or less like this. And I repeated the same for the other side. Normally I don't do this, but it's a quick way of creating a new texture that looks cool. Now to fix the hard edges, I used the smudge tool and the eraser tool as well to smooth things out. Finally, I added a few more details, stretched the texture a little bit up, and that's it, we got an aura texture. Then I imported to Unity and duplicated the ground wine material and rename it to Aura01 and proceed to assign the texture. I also duplicated the shell particle system and rename it to Aura2, assigned the material I just duplicated, and changed the render mode to vertical billboard. That's important. Now, this is all trippy, right? Of course. But first we don't want to scroll this texture, so let's set the Z of the custom data to 0. And the dissolve can be constant, something like 0.8 works fine. We also want the tiling of the main text to be 1 in the X, we don't want to repeat it. And up here, the start rotation is too much, let's set it to be between 10 and -10. The size needs to be much bigger, like between 6 and 5 in the X and 8 and 7 in the Y. I'm just gonna push this up a little bit so it doesn't touch the ground. And okay, it's looking pretty cool. Now the aura needs a short lifetime, like between 0.1 and 0.2. Okay, so that's flashing, but if we fade in with the color of a lifetime, we get a better feeling. Okay, let me just pause this before someone has an epileptic attack or something like that. Right, so in size over lifetime, we can copy the Z curve and turn off separate axis and paste the curve here. So it just grows a little bit in the start, like this, great. Now, final detail, let's add some stretched particles. For the particles I'm using this shader, it's very simple, very basic, you can copy it if you want, or you can use the default shader that comes with Unity. And then I created a material like this, and you can even use the default particle texture that comes with Unity, it's fine. Alright, so we need a new particle system, which is going to have the same duration, 2 seconds. It needs a short lifetime between 0.1 and 0.3, a fast start speed between 15 and 25, more or less, you know, and a small start size between 0.2 and 0.1. The color we will see in a moment, and the rate over time, it's going to be between something like 20 and 25, it should be fine. Now for the shape, let's first rotate the particle system minus 90 degrees in the X and add a small angle of 10, maybe. Let's fade them out, just like this, in color of lifetime, okay? Now in render mode, now let's set the render mode to be stretched billboard, with a speed scale of 0.05, maybe less. And finally we can drag the material. I'm gonna push this up in the Y just a little bit, and let's choose some colors to match the rest. And let's see how it goes with the rest of the particle systems. Okay, so in my case I'm going to increase the radius of the cone. Alright, that's pretty much it. It's looking really awesome. Maybe just decrease one of these colors to be a little bit darker, so it isn't always bright, you know. Okay, and I think it's looking really cool, very nice effect. And now it's really up to you, to your imagination. You can, for example, add a dark version of the ground wind. I basically duplicated this particle system, see, right here. And also duplicated the shader, but changed the blend mode to alpha. And that's why I can use dark colors, that's it. I then also duplicated the aura and created dark version, just to add some contrast basically, you know, yeah. You can customize the effect to your needs, of course. There's plenty of stuff you can do with this, and all of this is available on my Patreon page, by the way, in case you are interested. Your support will mean a lot to me. Talking about Patreon, I want to thank every patron that is supporting me. It really helps the channel going forward. And I want to say a big special thanks to the super mega patrons, which are Alejandro, Chris Coy, FortHeroGames.com, Goblin Plague, James Finlay, James Ramsey, Jeff Cardenas, Juan Mendiola, Ken Lee, Kim Chang-jung, Scott Wells Foster, Solofo Razafi Maelio, Stephen Melton, TK, Warden Studios, and Art and Jim. So that's it guys, thanks for watching, I hope you have enjoyed, and see you in the next video.